Hey guys, with the update coming so soon, I need to offload some replay footage I've saved, so here are some mildly interesting things about how stuff works in War Thunder. If you've played ARB at prop tier, you may have noticed that sometimes after setting an engine fire on an enemy, they sometimes seem to survive indefinitely, even if they don't put the fire out. This happened to me multiple times, where I would assume the enemy was dead because their engine was on fire, but they'd keep flying for up to over 5 minutes, without their fire ever getting extinguished, sometimes even being able to glide back to base and fully repair. At first I thought this was some sort of client-side visual bug, where maybe they actually used their fire extinguisher and it just hadn't shown up on my client, but it turns out that some planes just stop taking fire damage after a certain point. I tried this with the B-17 without fire extinguishers, and after getting set on fire in the engine and airframe would go near completely black, but it would never completely fall apart, letting my plane fly back to base without having to deal with the fire, at all. I've only noticed it affecting American planes, mainly the B-17, B-26, and Razorback P-47, but there could be more that I don't know about. I haven't tested everything. I'm not sure if this is a bug, but regardless, it's worth keeping in mind. When they changed the multipathing height, I was somewhat curious as to how exactly it actually worked, so I decided to take a closer look at what was going on. My initial theory was that Gaijin modeled multipathing as a radar reflection off of the ground, creating a mirror image that would fool the plane's radar into thinking that the plane is actually below the ground, and making the missile track that image below the ground. Obviously, there wouldn't be a reason for the missile to go for the image instead of the real plane in real life, but this is just how I thought Gaijin might have modeled this, hence the name Multipath. This would also mean that flying very low to the ground would be a bad idea, since the distance between you and your mirror would be very small and increase the chance of a proxy fuse detonating on your plane. But upon testing, this doesn't quite seem to be the way it works. I had a friendly fly at various altitudes to see where my radar square went, and it turns out that below 50 meters radar altitude, the radar lock offset isn't actually below the surface of the ground, it's actually fixed distance below the plane. Between 50 and 60 meters, the distance gets closer, until at 60 meters, the lock is aligned exactly with the plane. Firing a missile off shows that when the plane is below 50 meters, the distance offset is actually just 20 meters. I tried firing missiles at planes 5 meters above the ground, and it didn't go directly for the plane, so it's likely that this 20 meter offset is fixed as long as you're below 50 meters in altitude. Most planes' radar missiles have a proximity fuse of around 10 meters, with the AIM-7F and R-27ER having a fuse of 8 meters and the AIM-120 with a fuse of 12 meters, so you're pretty safe as long as you're below 50 meters in radar altitude. With Phoenix and Falkors, however, they have a proxy fuse of exactly 20 meters, meaning unless you're flying towards the side, trying to rely just on multipathing to defeat the missile is not a good idea. You can also adjust the radar altimeter red color limit in the options menu here, so I would recommend turning this to 50 instead of the default 60. Also, this offset only applies based off of your vertical distance to the ground, your radar altitude, and it does not apply to the shortest distance from you to the ground. So you have to get closer to an angled hill to achieve the same multipath effect than when flying over flat terrain, and hugging a cliff face is basically useless. It does, however, account for buildings, though. From the attacker's point of view, launching the missile from as high of an angle as possible gives you the best chance of your missile hitting the target trying to defeat your missile using just multipathing. But at too high of an angle, they end up notching you, so be careful of that. This is because when launching from as high of an angle as possible, the missile actually has to go past your plane in order to get to the image that it's trying to track. And so, by getting really close to it, it can detonate the proxy fuse and end up killing you anyways. In ARB mouse aim mode, the amount you can pull is limited by your angle of attack. The amount of AoA you can pull depends on your airspeed, with most prop planes having a graph that looks kind of like this. This is your corner speed, and at your corner speed, your control surfaces begin to lock up, so you lose your ability to pull full AoA the faster you go. This profile changes a bit the higher in altitude you go, but for the most part, the max AoA you can pull in the corner speed stay the same. You've seen that planes with leading edge wing slats turn better than ones without. For example, the F4E with slats versus the F4EJ without. While this is true, the way that it's modeled in-game is that the F4E is hard-coded to just turn better than the F4EJ, and the slats are just a visual animation that plays when your plane is pulling above a certain AoA. It's kind of like wingtip vortices. Comparing the AoA profiles of the F4E and the EJ, you can see that they deviate near 1050 kph, but the slats only start to deploy at around 950 kph, showing that the visual animations for the slats isn't actually what causes the extra AoA. Generally speaking, aircraft turn better when turning downwards than upwards. This is because for a given speed and AoA, your plane generates a certain amount of lift which goes into turning the aircraft. When you turn upwards though, the actual centripetal force generated is the lift minus the weight of the aircraft, while when turning downwards, the centripetal force is your lift plus your weight, so you turn harder when you pull downwards. To experimentally verify this theory, I set the aircraft speed fixed to 400 kph, set simulation time to half speed, and did both an upwards and downwards turn starting at 2000 meters altitude, timing how long it took to do a quarter turn. I set the speed fixed because I didn't want there to be any difference in speed effects or difference in altitude effects, and I set the speed to half time so that the amount of time that it took would be extended, and so the difference would be a lot more pronounced. And, as expected, the downward turn was significantly faster than the upwards turn. You might think that flying in a straight line is the best way to accelerate while minimizing drag. This method is good for most cases, but when you're flying level, your plane is actually generating lift, which means that in turn your plane is also generating induced drag. If we really want to minimize drag, you have to give a slight negative G inputs so that your wing is generating no lift, no induced drag, and you have a wing loading of 0. This basically puts your plane in a ballistic trajectory, following a parabolic path like how an object without wings would fall. Of course, you can't fly straight while unloading your wings, but this can help you accelerate more and reduce drag. If you've seen this video, you'll know that the way Gaijin models gun convergence and third-person crosshair in aircraft is kind of funky, but there's quite a lot of funkiness going on with crosshairs for ground vehicles too. As an overview, this is the mouse cursor, this is the mouse cursor with gun sight elevation accounted for, and this is the cannon indicator. Each one of these indicators are projected onto a surface in-game instead of being located at a set distance away, like in aircrafts. Your mouse cursor projects a line of sight from your camera to the surface the mouse cursor is on. The elevation adjusted cursor takes the position the mouse cursor is at, draws a line from the tank's breech to that position, goes vertically by the amount that the sight is angled, and projects a marker on that position. In most cases where you haven't elevated your gun using the sight distance control, the adjusted cursor is invisible, since it basically points to the same spot the mouse cursor is already pointing to. If there's an obstruction in the way, the marker is projected onto the obstruction. The cannon indicator works the same as the elevation adjusted cursor, except it points in the direction the cannon is currently pointing. So, as you can see here, there is a parallax effect created by the two lines of sight, one from the third-person camera and one from the cannon. This is what causes a lot of weird effects that happen when there are obstructions or targets very close to you. For example, when you move your cursor onto a tank that is right next to you, your cursor often clips right onto the top of their tank, leading the gun to suddenly elevate much more than you want it to, and you really have to force your mouse cursor down or use sniper mode in order to achieve the gun depression you actually want. Another result of this is that your gun can actually move in position when you zoom in while in third person. This is because when you zoom in, your camera angle stays the same, but your camera position changes, making the mouse cursor intersect at a different point from before. This results in the cannon needing to adjust for this difference. Also, if you have your mouse cursor pointed past an obstruction, go into sniper view, then leave sniper view, your mouse cursor will now be on the obstruction instead of past it where the cursor used to be. This is mainly useful for sniping in third-person view through obstructions while keeping your tank hidden, since your third-person camera allows you to see and accurately target enemies despite not having an immediate line of sight from your tank. I wanted to test where the camera, while in sniper view in RB, was located. I knew it was somewhere behind the gun barrel, but I didn't know exactly where. So to test this, I got a friend to drive next to me and slowly move their gun in front of my sight until his gun phased through the camera and I couldn't see anymore. And as it turns out, the camera is located at the point around which the gun rotates when it elevates, basically the vertical pivot point. This makes sense since the camera position won't have to change when the gun elevates or depresses. This also means that tanks that have a pivot point very far back, like French tanks with oscillating turrets, have their camera quite far back. There are exceptions to this, but for most tanks, this pivot point rule applies. It also seems to apply to all secondary guns and machine guns when using their respective sights. For tanks without any vertical traverse, like the STRV-103, I don't know how it works, since I don't have it and I can't test it. I haven't extensively tested this next part, but also I think the pivot point is where the round you fire spawns initially. I placed my gun inside of my friend's tank to intercept their Heat FS shell when they fire it, and it actually ended up detonating inside of their tank, breaking their gun barrel, breech, and killing their loader. Also, when you use sight distance control to change your elevation angle and adjust for shooting targets at range, the cannon doesn't just vertically pivot. Instead, it also horizontally traverses a bit to adjust for how much your tank is tilted on its roll axis. You can see this when you set your elevation distance high and fire it while very tilted. The round doesn't go in the direction where the tick marks are, but instead off to the side where it stays on the same vertical line as where your mouse is pointed. You can also see that the elevation adjusted cursor is always vertically above the mouse cursor while in third-person view, no matter how tipped over your tank is. This is nice since you don't have to guess where your round will land while using vertical targeting. Just point it at the enemy and estimate range. And one last tidbit. The distance markers in sniper mode are not actually always accurate. Say that a sight's distance markers are calibrated so that they work perfectly while shooting at tanks directly in front of them at the same elevation. The tick marks are spaced in a way so that it shows how much the shell drops over time due to gravity. Now let's take an extreme hypothetical where your gun is pointed directly upwards. Now the effects of gravity are parallel to the direction the round travels in. So while the rounds will now slow down faster, their path will be perfectly straight up and down. So if we were to use the same distance markers as we were firing horizontally, they would be inaccurate since the round would just travel straight along the zero line. Obviously, you're not going to ever really be firing straight up, but this is just an extreme example to demonstrate the fact that the higher the firing angle, the less accurate the distance markers become. For guns with high muzzle velocity, like darts at top-tier tanks, this effect is basically negligible since the bullets travel almost perfectly straight to begin with, but for rounds with very low muzzle velocities like howitzers and artillery, this effect is much more pronounced and can often lead you to miss shots while you're firing on targets that are higher or lower than you. So that's all the things I had to say for this video. I normally bring these interesting things up that I find in their relevant videos, but these facts were kind of miscellaneous, so I decided it was best to just make one big video compiling them. You can check those videos out if you haven't already watched them and want a deeper explanation on how they work. That's all for now. I'll see you guys around. Bye bye.